In Egypt, on the edge of the desert, there's a plateau that sits at 29.98 degrees north. 1,200 miles away, in the mountains of Iran, the ceremonial capital of the Persian Empire, sits at 29.93 degrees north. And 3,000 miles past that, high on the Tibetan plateau, the holiest city in Tibetan Buddhism sits at 29.65. 3 sacred capitals, 3 civilizations separated by mountain ranges, deserts, and thousands of years, all within a few dozen miles of the same invisible line around the Earth. Tonight we're going to do something most videos on this topic won't. We're going to check the coordinates, every single one, on screen. Because this mystery has 2 versions. There's the version the internet tells, and part of it, I'll show you, falls apart the moment you open a map. And then there's the version that survives the fact check. The part that's real, measurable, and still doesn't have a clean explanation. And buried inside the real version is a number, carved into the Great Pyramid itself, that shouldn't have been possible to know 4,500 years ago. We'll get to it. But first, open the file. Here's the claim, in its strongest form. Take the line of latitude 30 degrees north, 1/3 of the way from the equator to the pole, and follow it around the planet. In Egypt, it passes within 2 miles of the Great Pyramid of Giza. Keep going east, and you reach the ruins of ancient Sumer, and Eridu, some of the first cities human beings ever built, sitting just above the line in southern Iraq. Further east, Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of an empire that ruled half the ancient world.
So the pattern, as claimed, Egypt, Sumer, Persia, Tibet. 4 cradles of civilization and sacred tradition, strung along one line like beads. Therefore, the argument goes, someone or something chose this latitude, a lost global culture. Ancient surveyors, take your pick of theories. But here's where this file gets interesting, because the internet version doesn't stop at 4 sites. It adds more. The Indus Valley cities, sometimes even sites in the Americas. And that's exactly where we're going to start pulling threads. Let's check every site that gets attached to this claim. Real coordinates, on screen, right now. Giza, 29.98, that's 2 miles off the line, verified. Persepolis, 29.93, verified. Lhasa, 29.65, about 24 miles south, close, verified, with an asterisk. And Eridu, just under 31 degrees, within about 60 miles, in the band, but not exact, the way some videos claim. Now, Mohenjo-daro, the great city of the Indus Valley, a site the viral versions of this story love to include, 27.3 degrees. That is almost 200 miles off the line. If Mohenjo-daro counts as being on the 30th parallel, then so does Houston, Texas. Actually, Houston is closer, so here's the honest score. The famous version of this mystery is padded. Some sites genuinely cluster near 30 north, with startling precision. Others got dragged onto the line because the story sounded better, with more beads on the string. And that's really the reason this channel exists. Every file we open here gets this same treatment, the claim, and then the audit. If that's the kind of history you want, subscribe, because the archive only grows from here. Now, back to the part of this file that didn't fall apart. But, and this is the pivot everything turns on, when you throw out the padded sites and keep only what verifies, the cluster that remains gets harder to explain, not easier. If real, what explains it? Archaeologists offer 3 answers. Let's test each one. Explanation 1. Climate. 30 degrees north sits in a sweet spot. Warm enough to farm year-round, close to the great river valleys, the Nile, the Tigris and Euphrates, the Indus. Civilizations didn't choose a latitude. They chose rivers, and the rivers happen to live in this band. That explains why civilizations arose in this general belt. But it doesn't explain the precision. The habitable band is 700 miles wide. The Nile runs north-south for over 4,000 miles. Egypt could have put its greatest monument anywhere along it. It ended up 2 miles from the 30th parallel. Climate gets you to the neighborhood. It doesn't get you to the address. Explanation 2. Coincidence and our own pattern-hunting brains. Humans built thousands of ancient cities. Pick any line on Earth and something important sits near it. We notice the hits and forget the misses. It's called selection bias, and it's a real effect. Athens isn't on the line. Rome isn't. Babylon misses by more than 2 degrees. Some of this pattern is us, doing what human brains do. But coincidence has a much harder time with the next part of this file. Because at Giza, the 30th parallel doesn't look like an accident. It looks like a target. Explanation 3. They were measuring the sky. Here's something true anywhere on Earth. The height of the celestial pole above your horizon equals your latitude. Stand at 30 degrees north. Find true north in the sky, and it hangs exactly 30 degrees up. 1/3 of the way from horizon to zenith. Which means any culture that watched the stars carefully, and every one of these cultures did, could know they were standing at 30 north. No satellites, no maps, just geometry and patience. The line was findable. Ancient astronomers could locate it. But could they actually hit it with precision? That question takes us to the strangest document in this file.
Remember the number I mentioned at the start, the one carved into the pyramid itself? Here it is. The Great Pyramid isn't just near 30 degrees north. Its sides face true north, south, east, and west, with an error of about 1/20th of 1 degree. That's not pretty good for the Bronze Age. Modern surveyors with modern instruments would call that impressive. To do that, Egyptian builders had to track the sky with a precision we still don't fully understand. Scholars have proposed methods using the sun's shadow at the equinox, or paired stars circling the pole, and each theory works on paper, but no record survives of which one they used. The knowledge existed, operated at master level, and then vanished without leaving an instruction manual. Now put the whole verified file together. A culture in Egypt that could find true north to a 20th of a degree, sitting 2 miles off the 30th parallel. A Persian capital on the same line. Sumerian first cities in the same narrow band. A Tibetan holy city 1,000 years later. Same story. Cultures that demonstrably had the astronomical skill to know exactly where they were standing. If you want the deep dive on how Egypt found true north without a compass, that's file number 2. It's on the channel next week. Subscribe so it's waiting for you.
But here's what the file cannot tell us, and I won't pretend it can. Skill is not the same as intent. We can prove these cultures could find the line. We cannot prove they chose it. No Egyptian text says build at 30. No Sumerian tablet mentions the parallel. The evidence stops exactly 1 step short of an answer. So here's where file number 1 ends. The viral version of this mystery, partly padded, and now you know exactly which parts. But the core of it is real. Several of the most sacred sites of the ancient world cluster on a line their builders had the knowledge to find. A line marked in the sky itself, 1/3 of the way from equator to pole. Coincidence that had help from geography, or the faint fingerprint of something deliberate, an idea about where on earth sacred ground belonged, arrived at separately by people who never met. The honest answer is, the file stays open. That's what this archive is for. We don't close files with guesses. We close them with evidence, or we don't close them at all. This has been Archives Unknown. File number 1 remains open.